Versailles, 1788. The palace gleamed like a celestial mirage. Gold leaf shimmered on every cornice, silk tapestries danced in candlelight, and chandeliers dripped with crystal stars. To the masses beyond its marble gates, it was a monument to excess. But to those within, those who truly ruled, the Château de Versailles was a cathedral of blood. Beneath the masked balls and powdered wigs, under the perfume of lilies and politics, there thrived a secret older than the French crown, the Syndicate de Versailles, an ancient vampire covenant led by the Queen herself, Marie Antoinette, last daughter of the House of Habsburg and High Priestess of the Crimson Court. She did not walk among the dead. She commanded them. In the public eye, Marie Antoinette was a scandal, a foreign queen with a taste for fashion, gambling, and scandalous whispers. But the truth was more sinister and infinitely more calculated. The Queen's infamous indulgence was no weakness, it was camouflage. While pamphleteers smeared her with crude caricatures and revolutionaries cursed her name, she was quietly drawing power from every scream, every tear, every drop of spilled revolutionary blood. Versailles was not merely a palace. It was a feeding ground. Each month, beneath the Hall of Mirrors, the court gathered not for politics but for sustenance. The great salon transformed into a sanctum, mirrors covered, candles dipped in oxblood, music slowed to funereal reverence. Noblemen, duchesses, foreign dignitaries, all part of her inner circle, all undead, all eternally beautiful and eternally hungry. They feasted on those who dared to oppose them. Jacobin agitators, rogue journalists, peasant firebrands. Anyone who stirred the pot of revolution too hard often vanished, arrested on dubious charges, declared traitors, and quietly delivered to Versailles under the veil of night. Their blood was spiced with fire, rebellion, and pain, perfect fuel for the arcane rites that bound the Queen's power. At the Queen's side stood Duc Armand de Savoy, her ancient steward and enforcer, known only among the Covenant as Le Prince du Sang. A creature of cold calculation, Armand had turned during the reign of Louis XIV and had since acted as both butcher and diplomat. He maintained the blood economy of the court, balancing the need for secrecy with the insatiable thirst of the nobles. He would stroll into dungeons wearing velvet and pearls, kneel beside a blindfolded prisoner and whisper, "Your voice screamed for liberty. Now your blood will sing for eternity." Even the Queen feared his ambition. But he was loyal, for now. Then there was Madame du Bar, called La Diablesse Parfumée, the perfumed devil. She once seduced an entire battalion of Swiss guards, draining each of them by dawn while leaving behind scented gloves and ribbons stained with garnet. She moved like a rumor through the palace, her influence laced in every scandal. Her bloodline magic allowed her to taste thoughts, making her a mistress of intrigue and interrogation. No secret remained unspoken under her touch. Together, the Queen, Armand, and du Bar formed a triumvirate of terror masked in powdered civility. The Versailles Syndicate was governed by an ancient pact, the Edict du Sang, forged in the Black Plague era when the French monarchy turned to the undead for protection during Europe's darkest days. In exchange for longevity, foresight, and strength, the royal house permitted vampires to infiltrate its nobility, assuming titles and influence in the daylight world. But power demanded balance. Each vampire was bound by blood oath not to turn peasants, clergy, or revolutionaries. The masses were to remain mortal, fearful, docile, edible. The Covenant feared that widespread vampirism would dilute their superiority and provoke holy wrath. Feeding was ritualized, hidden. Violations were punished by flame. Yet cracks had begun to show. The revolution was not just a political movement. It was spiritual unrest. The very taste of Parisian blood had changed. It boiled with prophecy. The syndicate could feel the tides shifting. And so they adapted. They didn't resist the revolution. They provoked it. In secret conclaves, Armand funded radical publications that stoked anti-monarchist sentiment. Madame du Bar whispered sedition into the ears of starving poets. The Queen approved executions not to silence dissent, but to grow it. Every corpse dumped into the Seine was another ember in the fire. And from that fire the Crimson Court drank deep. As the mobs chanted for bread, the syndicate savored revolution like fine wine. But not all vampires agreed with this dark alchemy. Whispers reached Versailles of an underground order rising in the catacombs. Monks, disillusioned aristocrats, feral blood priests exiled centuries ago. They spoke of a coming storm not to feed from, but to cleanse. They called themselves Crimson Égalité, and they viewed Versailles as a blasphemy. Their emblem, a crimson lily with its stem broken. Their oath, Liberté Égalité, et le sang pour tous. Blood for all. One autumn evening Marie Antoinette stood alone in her rose garden. Her gown shimmered like starlight, her parasol casting strange shadows. She held a goblet carved from bone, filled not with wine but with a young revolutionary's lifeblood. Do they truly believe they can unseat me? She whispered not to anyone present, but to something deeper, an ancestral force that had whispered to her through dreams since childhood. A raven landed beside her. Its eyes were clouded with blood. The Republic dreams, she said, smiling faintly. But dreams die at dawn. From the palace behind her came music, laughter, and the quiet rustle of silk. But the shadows of Versailles were no longer loyal. Something stirred beyond the gilded walls. Something old, something angry, and something with fangs of its own. And so, as the sun set behind the golden facade of France's most glorious palace, the Crimson Court made its final toast. To immortality, the Queen murmured, raising her chalice. And somewhere in Paris, a guillotine was being built. Paris, 1789. The cobblestones ran red. The Bastille fell not from sheer mortal rage, but from centuries of silent planning, whispered oaths, and blood-soaked scripture hidden beneath the catacombs of Paris. The revolution the world believed had erupted spontaneously was, in truth, a blade sharpened in shadow, wielded not by the people but by the Crimson Égalité. This new vampire faction did not wear silk. They did not attend salons. They had no use for mirrors. They were the counter-order, exiles, visionaries, and bloodwalkers who had once served Versailles but now sought its end. Where the Versailles Syndicate fed on rebellion to sustain their immortality, the Égalité fed rebellion itself, guiding its fury like a conductor commanding an orchestra of fire. At their center stood a name whispered in both vampire courts and revolutionary circles. The Red Herald. None knew his true name. Some said he had once been a Templar knight, turned by a dying vampire on a battlefield soaked in Crusader blood. Others whispered he had been a Jesuit theologian excommunicated for claiming vampires were not demons, but gods. What all agreed upon was this: the Red Herald walked in daylight. He could not do so long. His skin blistered. His eyes burned. But it made him a legend, proof that he was something more than mere vampire, something born of prophecy, not accident. Where the Versailles Syndicate kept their feeding orderly, ritualized, elegant, the Herald disrupted it with surgical chaos. He raided syndicate blood caches, freed prisoners bound for the Queen's table, infiltrated noble houses and turned their heirs into saboteurs. And most damningly, he turned the people into a weapon. The syndicate feeds on fear, he wrote in one pamphlet. Then we shall give them fire. The revolution needed martyrs and the Égalité provided them. They turned low-born butchers into revolutionary icons, orchestrated arrests of harmless peasants to inflame public outrage, and assassinated moderates to make way for extremists. Everything was a blood ritual. Everything was theater. Each public execution released a resonance, a psychic discharge of trauma, rage, and belief. Versailles vampires had long harvested such moments to fuel spells and extend their glamours. But the Égalité changed the alchemy. They didn't consume revolution. They channeled it. In secret crypts beneath Montparnasse, they transformed these violent energies into arcane sigils, tattooed into their flesh with molten silver, encoded into the guillotine blades themselves. Some of them could shapeshift. Others could whisper madness. A few, the most cursed, could tear memories from a man's mind just by drinking a single drop. What was once noble vampirism had become weaponized mutation. Maximilien Robespierre was not a vampire. He was something far more dangerous. A believer. Though mortal, his mind had been cracked open by the Red Herald during a blood rite known as the Evil de Marat. In this forbidden ritual, Robespierre was shown the secret history of France, not the one written in textbooks, but the one scrawled in blood across centuries. He saw the Roman vampires who shaped Charlemagne. He wept at visions of Joan of Arc fed to the Versailles court to break her visions. He understood then that the monarchy was not human. It was immortal. When he awoke, he no longer saw kings and queens. He saw parasites. He was reborn as the Republic's prophet, not of liberty alone but of cleansing fire. And the Égalité followed him. They protected him not as a master but as a living relic. Through him the revolution gained speed and savagery. And as the executions began to outpace the arrests, the syndicate began to bleed. Back in Versailles the Crimson Court trembled. Marie Antoinette watched as the map of France darkened. Entire towns no longer answered to the crown. Nobles vanished en route to Paris, their carriages found days later. Horses dead, doors broken, blood soaked into the upholstery but no bodies. The queen summoned the oracle, a seer older than Versailles itself, who lived entombed in a chamber of bone fed only royal blood. The oracle whispered just one sentence before it crumbled to ash. You have drunk the storm. Now the sky drinks you. The Versailles Syndicate had fed too greedily for too long. Their hunger had bred the very fury that now hunted them. Worse still, armed, the Prince of Blood had begun to suggest the unthinkable, an alliance with the Vatican. I would rather burn, the queen hissed, than beg Rome for salvation. To which Armand replied, then prepare for fire, your majesty. The Égalité had infiltrated every layer of the collapsing state. They wore the faces of dockworkers, opera singers, even executioners. The guillotine itself, crafted by royal engineers, was now consecrated with vampire blood and engraved with sigils visible only in moonlight. It did more than kill. It harvested. Each noble beheaded became part of the growing psychic storm that pulsed beneath Paris. The Red Herald's followers called it La Vague Rouge, the Red Wave. They said it would one day sweep across Europe and bury all monarchies in its wake. Whispers reached Vienna, Prussia, London. Foreign vampire enclaves panicked. Treaties once sealed in fangs and blood were burned. The old world teetered, and the Égalité rejoiced. They had become what Versailles had always feared, a new aristocracy of blood, but born of revolution, not royalty. One night, under the cover of smoke and fireworks, a syndicate envoy attempted to assassinate the Red Herald. The assassin was an ancient turned in the Crusades, a warlock of blood and shadow. The herald did not resist. Instead, he bit down on a vial of holy water hidden beneath his tongue, shattering it into his own body, and embraced the assassin as they both ignited in celestial flame. Only one rose from the ashes. The assassin was never seen again. The herald emerged scarred, his flesh still smoldering, his fangs blackened. He declared, I am the answer to the ancient lie. The flame and the fong. The crown of ash. From that day, even members of the syndicate began defecting. By autumn, the true war was no longer waged on the streets, but beneath them. In the catacombs, beneath Paris' stacked bones and forgotten saints, vampire met vampire in a silent, endless slaughter. Glamours failed. Magic bled. Old bloodlines were hunted to extinction. Dubar, once the perfumed devil, now stalked the tunnels like a feral dog, abandoned by the queen for failing to silence the crimson wave. Armand deployed spellhounds crafted from resurrected royal hounds, their teeth laced with garlic and silver, their growls echoing like ghost bells. But the Égalité kept coming. Not for power. Not for thrones. But for vengeance. In a hidden church-turned-sanctuary near the Rue Saint-Denis, Robespierre met privately with the Red Herald beneath shattered stained glass. They think we want what they had, Robespierre said. But we don't. The herald nodded slowly. We want what they denied. And what is that? Robespierre asked. The vampire smiled. A world that bleeds without masters. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame tolled. Not for mass. Not for the king. But for the death of an era. Paris, 1792. The blade fell and the crowd roared. Another noble's head tumbled into the wicker basket. Blood soaked the stones. Revolutionaries cheered, clutching tricolor flags and shouting oaths of liberty. But above the noise, beyond the eyes of mortals, an older hunger stirred. For the guillotine had become more than an instrument of justice. It was a shrine, a sigil, a portal, and it sang to those who could hear it. Unknown to the crowds flooding the Place de la Révolution, the execution device had been altered. Crafted originally by royal engineers under the watchful eye of Versailles, the blade bore enchantments designed to silence life, severing soul from body in an instant, clean, efficient, final. But now it had been reconsecrated. The Crimson Égalité, those rebel vampires who had infiltrated every level of the new republic, had performed blood rites under the scaffold, coating the frame in a thin mixture of powdered bone and human ash. They had infused the oak supports with sigils of remembrance, pain, and wrath. They had braided threads of their own hair into the ropes. Each death fed the structure, not with blood but with belief. As the nobility fell, the energy stored within the device grew. The Red Herald called it a siphon for divine guilt. Others simply named it what it had become: the shadow guillotine. For vampires, death by decapitation was final. The Syndicate had long relied on isolation and mysticism to shield themselves. Deaths within the court were rare and ritualized. But the shadow guillotine changed that balance. Executions were now public, with hundreds witnessing the end of beings who had walked the earth for centuries. Worse, each death amplified the latent arcane resonance in the area. The guillotine was becoming sentient in a sense, not alive but aware of purpose. And it did not serve kings. It served judgment. Each time it fell, a pulse shot through the catacombs beneath Paris. Vampire hideouts cracked. Sigils shattered. Mental wards failed. Entire bloodlines that had remained hidden for generations were exposed. It was not simply an execution device. It was a sonar of death. A bell that rang through the underworld. And the Versailles Syndicate began to panic. The war, once cold and ritualistic, turned savage. In the tunnels beneath St. Mary, an entire syndicate conclave was ambushed by Égalité warforms. These creatures, no longer even humanoid, were vampires who had allowed themselves to evolve into monstrous avatars of rage, shedding human skin for pure function. Fanged mandibles, eyes grown shut, tongues laced with venom. The noble vampires, clad in silk and illusion, were torn apart in moments. Elsewhere in the crypt beneath Sainte-Chapelle, two vampire duelists, one in tricolor, the other in Versailles violet, fought a silent, floating battle above the bones of saints. Their blood shimmered with memory. Their blades were forged from ivory and gilt. They fought not for land or gold, but for who deserved to shape eternity. In the end, both were consumed by sentient shadows. At Versailles, the air had grown still. The palace, once echoing with music and laughter, had become a mausoleum. Gilded halls were now cloaked in velvet shadows. Mirrors were draped. Chandeliers stood unlit. The queen no longer held court. She prayed alone in the chapel of the Crimson Flame, whispering to the statues of forgotten gods older than Christ. Marie Antoinette had lost her husband, her children, her crown. But more than that, she had lost control. The syndicate was fractured. Some fled to Austria or Venice, seeking sanctuary among other ancient blood courts. Others went rogue, offering secrets to the Égalité in exchange for mercy. The queen's inner circle shrank by the hour. Her most loyal servant, Duc Armand de Savoy, urged her to unleash the Cerulean Guard, undead knights bound in ice and silence, kept slumbering beneath the Alps since the time of Charlemagne. But she refused. They were built for wars between gods, she said softly. Not for children who play with fire. Instead, she turned to her last gamble, the blood mirror. Hidden in a secret room beneath her dressing chambers, the blood mirror was older than France itself. It had been carved from volcanic glass by Babylonian priests and fed with Pharaoh's blood during the fall of Memphis. It did not show reflections, it showed futures. But each vision came with a price. Marie Antoinette bled herself before it, pressing her palm to the obsidian and whispering her true name, the one not even Louis knew. The mirror flared red, then black. Then he saw the guillotine. But it wasn't at the center of a square. It was in a cathedral. The pews were filled with shadows. The altar broken. Stained glass rained down in reverse. And atop the scaffold stood a woman in a tattered crown, herself, smiling as the blade rose above her neck. She gasped, pulled away. The mirror cracked. A voice echoed in her head, cold and final. Your death is not the end. It is the signal. The queen's premonition arrived too late. In the heart of the Crimson Court, betrayal had already bloomed. Madame du Bar, once known as the perfumed devil, had vanished weeks earlier. Many believed she had been executed by mob justice. But she had not died. She had defected. At a secret ceremony beneath the Pont Neuf, Du Bar swore fealty to the Red Herald, offering the queen's true name, the structure of the Versailles feeding rituals, and the locations of the last blood sanctuaries hidden in the countryside. Her price: to be made immortal again. The herald, smiling through cracked lips, poured revolution itself into her veins. Rage, hope, fire, memory. She did not become a vampire again. She became something new. In the days that followed, syndicate strongholds collapsed. Temples turned to tombs. Armand de Savoy was ambushed en route to the Pyrenees and immolated by fire that spoke Latin. His last words, she was right. It was always going to burn. Only Marie remained. She left Versailles under moonlight, traveling in a black carriage drawn by wolves. She did not look back. There was nothing left to rule. Paris awaited. So did the guillotine. At the base of the scaffold, the shadow guillotine pulsed with anticipation. It had been fed over 1,000 souls. It had sung 1,000 songs. But one voice still escaped it. One melody still lingered. The Queen. In hidden chambers below, Robespierre and the Red Herald made final preparations for the rite. They had no intention of killing her in the usual sense. Her death would be a rebirth. The blade would fall, not to silence her but to release the final psychic key encoded in her blood. The ritual would ignite across the ether. All undead monarchies across Europe would be unbound. Every vampire court, Venice, Krakow, Cairo, Vienna, would feel the blow. Thrones would melt. Crowns would crumble. And in their place something else would rise. Not anarchy, but immortal equality. Paris, 1793. The stars turned their faces away. The city had become a furnace. Not of fire but of transformation. Smoke from burning estates curled through narrow streets. The stench of blood and iron clung to every flag, every prayer, every silence. The revolution no longer whispered of liberty. It screamed for finality. At the center of this maelstrom stood the Place de la Révolution. Where once stood a proud statue of Louis XV, now rose the shadow guillotine, gleaming black under the moonlight, its blade shimmering with ethereal runes invisible to mortal eyes. And soon it would sing one last time. They paraded her through the streets in a simple white dress. Gone was the lace, the powdered hair, the diamonds threaded into her skin like light. Marie Antoinette, once Queen of France, High Priestess of the Versailles Syndicate, now looked every bit the mortal she had so long mimicked. Bound. Exposed. But her eyes burned. She said nothing as rotten fruit struck her shoulder. She flinched not as jeers echoed from every balcony. Instead she studied the city, her city, one last time. She saw the shadows move not as humans but as them. Crimson Égalité acolytes hidden in the mobs, walking among mortals like shepherds among cattle. Above them all, in a cathedral bell tower, stood the Red Herald, watching her approach. He bowed once, solemn and slow, as the Queen passed beneath his gaze. We end what we began, his thoughts whispered across the ether. This was no mere execution. The Queen's death had been engineered, layer by layer, moment by moment, by the Crimson Égalité, not as vengeance, but as the keystone of a grand ritual. Her blood was the last thread binding the Versailles Covenant to reality. Her soul, ancient and burdened by centuries of forbidden rites, was an arcane key. When the blade fell, it would not simply sever her head. It would sever the entire age. Beneath the scaffold, hidden in a newly excavated ossuary, Égalité blood mages traced final sigils into the ground with chalk made from powdered vampire bones. They arranged tokens of the fallen. A lock of Armand's scorched hair, Dubar's silken gloves now soaked in crimson ink, and a shattered pendant from Louis's turning ceremony. Each item anchored a memory node, a piece of Versailles encoded into time. Their destruction would cause a cascading collapse, unbinding not only the syndicate's power, but their legacy across Europe. A continent would forget their rule. History itself would blink. In the final hour before the ritual, a priest was offered to the Queen. He entered the prison cell expecting a frail creature, broken and whispering for absolution. What he found was a queen seated like a monarch, back straight, hair braided with white ribbon, her skin luminous despite her shackles. She said nothing, only gestured for him to sit. He hesitated. She looked into his eyes, and he obeyed. "You are not here for me," she said. "You are here to bear witness." He asked why she had not fled, why the wolves had not come for her, why she did not command the storm to rise. "Because storms no longer fear me," she answered. "They serve another now." Then she smiled, not bitter, not cruel, but almost tender. "But I am not finished. Not truly." She pressed her fingers to her temple. "They forget what I am. What I made possible. The herald thinks me a relic. But I am the altar. The chalice. The fire starter. The priest, trembling, tried to offer her scripture. She touched his lips gently. And he fell into sleep. The morning sky was gray. Pale. Silent. Marie Antoinette was led to the scaffold through narrow corridors of soldiers. No words were spoken. No verdict read. The city held its breath. But within the crowd, hidden in plain sight, stood every remaining vampire of note. Nobles who had refused to flee. Rogue syndicate survivors. Even agents of rival undead courts who had traveled in secret to witness the end of an empire. Above them all, the Red Herald stood beneath a black canopy of mourning. He held no weapon. Only a single rose, its petals made of dried blood. He nodded to the executioner. And the world grew still. Time stuttered. As the queen placed her neck beneath the blade, she whispered a final phrase in a tongue older than Latin. The scaffold pulsed. The runes engraved by the Égalité flickered, not with crimson but with gold. Panic bloomed in the herald's eyes. Too late. The queen had rewired the ritual. The final key was not death, it was willing death. A sacrifice by choice. The moment the blade touched her skin, a scream erupted, not from her throat but from the city itself. Buildings wept. Bells shattered. A tremor cracked the foundations of Notre Dame. The Eiffel Gate, a secret relic buried under the Seine, exploded in blue fire. Vampire sanctums in Venice, London and Prague convulsed as memory wards shattered. And in the streets of Paris, mortals fell to their knees, not in fear but in a moment of sublime vertigo, as if they had forgotten something deeply important but could not name what. The syndicate fell not in battle but in silence. Their names vanished from memory. Their portraits crumbled to ash. Letters disintegrated in archives. Noble titles dissolved. Crypts emptied. Even surviving vampires began to question whether the Versailles Covenant had ever truly existed. In Austria, Marie's childhood home, her painted visage faded from canvas overnight. In the Louvre, a golden seal once embedded in the floor cracked open to reveal nothing. And in Versailles the palace, now abandoned, shifted. Its mirrors shattered inward. Its gardens withered. A wind passed through the halls that sang in a voice only vampires could hear. Balance has been paid. The Red Herald stood before the cracked scaffold for 3 days. He did not speak. Not when the Égalité gathered to celebrate. Not when Robespierre approached asking for guidance. Not even when the guillotine itself dissolved into dust. He finally moved when the sun rose on the 4th day, walking into the light without flinching, his skin hissing, his blood boiling. But he did not die. He could not. For the queen's final gift was this: remembrance. She had bound him to memory, ensuring that someone would remember the syndicate. Not to resurrect it, but to understand it. To carry forward its mistakes so they would not be repeated. In this way she did not defeat him. She used him. Beneath Montmartre, in a forgotten catacomb sealed in lead, something stirs. A coffin black as void rests in a circle of unlit candles. Inside lies Marie Antoinette. Not dead. Not dreaming. Waiting. Her soul, scattered across the ley lines of Europe, will one day return. Not to rule but to decide. When the next empire of blood rises, she will awaken. For revolution may end thrones. But not hunger. And not queens. France, 1794. The queen was dead. But the city did not cheer. The revolution had devoured so many nobles, priests, radicals, generals, even its own prophets. Blood no longer provoked awe or fear. It stirred only numbness. Robespierre wept in solitude. He could not explain why. He remembered watching the blade fall. He remembered Marie Antoinette's stillness, her final gaze turned skyward. But since then his thoughts fractured like mirrors. He forgot the taste of speeches. He forgot the sound of her voice. He forgot why her death had mattered. Only that it had felt like the world tilting. The guillotine was dismantled the following week. Not from mercy, but because it had stopped working. The final cut had severed more than a neck. It had sliced through memory, magic, and monarchy. Paris entered a strange season. No songs rose from the salons. No sermons boomed in churches. A silence settled in every quarter, heavy and expectant, as if history itself were pausing to breathe. Robespierre, once a roaring flame, became somber. He rarely spoke. His followers, sensing something shift beneath the skin of the world, turned inward. Many began to disappear. Not arrested, not exiled. Gone like paper eaten by fire. Untraceable. The Republic held elections. Reforms. Parades. But the revolution had become ash without fuel. And in that ash something older moved. The Red Herald stood on the steps of the old Palais Royal, eyes closed as pigeons circled above. Where once he burned with fury, now he simply listened. To the silence. To the void Marie had left. She had not simply died. She had sacrificed herself to redirect the ritual, undoing centuries of Versailles dominance and infecting the Égalité with something unexpected. Consequence. The Shadow Guillotine's final act had disrupted more than power. It had cracked time. The Herald's followers began to change. Some could no longer bear daylight, even briefly. Others grew pale, silent, reflective. They ceased reveling in revolution. They began studying it. The Égalité had won the war. But in doing so they had become what they once hated. A structure. A hidden republic. An invisible parliament. A syndicate in all but name. Deep beneath the catacombs where the bones of 6 million Parisians slumbered, the Red Herald convened the first Assembly du Crépuscule. The Twilight Assembly. There were no thrones. No titles. Just a circle of carved stone and shadows. Each member bore a brand. 3 crescent scars over the heart, burned by silver. A reminder. Power was not to be held but shared. This was their mantra. But the Herald knew better. Power, even when shared, eventually hungered for permanence. Some delegates spoke of replacing the mortal republic, of guiding its leaders through manipulation. Others spoke of expansion. London, Vienna, Madrid, cities ripe with confusion and collapse. The old courts were gone. There was room to build. The Herald listened. And said nothing. He simply laid a single rose at the center of the circle. Its petals were made of dried blood. And its stem pointed east. In the months that followed, strange documents began to surface across Europe. Old vampire names scrawled in margins. Ritual blueprints embedded in ledger books. Whispered recollections of noble patrons who never aged. Some thought it coincidence. Others called it mass hysteria. But those with knowledge saw the truth. Marie Antoinette had infected history itself. Her death did not erase Versailles. It seeded it. Memory fragments floated like pollen, drifting into mortal institutions. Secret archives. Private libraries. Forgotten symphonies that contain the pulse of ancient rituals in their rhythm. The Red Herald realized it first. They had not destroyed Versailles. They had released it. And now it was everywhere. By 1795, the Crimson Égalité was no longer just a vampire rebellion. It was a shadow state. It whispered through the new France. It advised ministers under the guise of dreams. It influenced architects to rebuild Paris with specific angles. Alignments tuned not to stars but to blood memory. It did not wear capes or drink in public. It filed reports. It signed treaties. It passed unnoticed in cafes and councils. Its agents were lawyers, midwives, writers, masons. They no longer needed fangs. They had found a new tool more effective than terror. Paperwork. Bureaucracy became a vessel. Mortals enforced laws drafted in crypts. Entire regions unknowingly followed policies that aligned with vampire feeding cycles, breeding patterns, or magical resonance points. The Immortal Republic had no need for thrones or crowns. It ruled in subtext. By 1797, a special room was sealed beneath the Louvre's foundation. It was not marked on any blueprint. No one spoke of it. Not even Napoleon, when he toured the galleries above, knew of the black door tucked behind a false storage alcove. Inside, a single obsidian coffin. Unopened. Surrounded by candles that never melted. Guarded by no one, but always watched. No one could explain why it hummed when approached. But the highest members of the Égalité, now known simply as Les Voiles, the Veiled, knew the truth. The Queen's soul had not scattered. It had settled. In the moment of her death, Marie Antoinette's consciousness had bound itself to a physical anchor, one prepared long before her fall. Her body had perished. Her presence had not. She would not awaken in this century. But she would be remembered. And in this new world, memory was power. A child is born in Lion. He dreams of a hall of mirrors filled with shadows that smile. He becomes an architect. A widow in Marseille writes a play about a queen who weeps blood and raises cities with her voice. She burns the script but hears the dialogue in her sleep. A diplomat in Cairo receives a rose from an unnamed courier. Its petals are gray. Its stem pricks him. He bleeds and sees Paris in flame. They are not connected, but they are not unconnected. The immortal republic is no longer a court, nor a revolution. It is a current flowing through the minds and hearts of a people who believe they are free. And beneath it all, waiting patiently for the next storm, lies the last queen of blood. Her eyes closed, but smiling.